is Hannah Palpant, and I'm the Senior Director of Advancement Strategy and Services here at the University of Laverne. And I'm so honored to be a part of this lecture, Pathways to Peace lecture series. It is such a delight. This is our second one that we have, and we have more lined up. And it is just a great focus on peacemaking, and that is so important to our campus here at the University of Laverne. We are very excited about tonight's lecture, Harmonizing Diverse Worldviews, and our speaker will be formally introduced in just a moment. I want to extend a special welcome to our guest speaker and express gratitude to you for being part of this lecture series. The university has a very long-standing connection to the value of peace, a central value of the Church of Brethren, founders of the university. There is a significant resonance between the university's foundation and the Bahai community. Bahai communities are diligent advocates for the promise of world peace and have developed strategies to encourage peace and values of oneness, unity, harmony, justice, and the nobility of humanity. I come this evening with deep gratitude for this community here because they actively create avenues of hope. Thank you to the Spiritual Assembly of the Bahai and Rancho Cucamonga who envisioned the creation of this lecture series. At this time, it is my privilege to introduce Sohaila Azizi, a member of the Spiritual Assembly of Bahai of Rancho Cucamonga and a key collaborator for this lecture series. Sohaila.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll just make one editorial correction. I'm part of the Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of Upland, and we do collaborate with all the spiritual assemblies in the Inland Valley and the Inland region. So thank you so much, Dr. Pan. Sherry Milet is not here, but she sent the best representation of that office to us. And I want to express the gratitude of the Baha'i communities around this area to the University of Laverne for the roles that they've taken on in leadership with the spirituality and peacemaking efforts. And they have been a collaborator and a partner with the Baha'i community for more than 2 decades. I would say that we've started many, many years ago with the School of Religion, with the School of Philosophy, and with the Office of Community Advancement. So without any further delay, I would love to introduce our speaker. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce not only the speaker and presenter, but my soul sister. So Ymasumac and I have gone back without aging each other for about more than 3 decades also. So we were little kids and we were playing, right? Except that she was in some villages that you will know about. I have no idea that what part of the world, I would have been at that time. So Ymasumac Marañón Davis, hope that the pronunciation does it justice, is a writer, educational consultant, university lecturer, and this one you'll find interesting, keeper of intuitive healing spaces, right? That's a title I had not seen. She shares ancestry from the Quechua people of Bolivia and the early pilgrims of New England. What a great combination, right? As a child, she lived in a village in the Yucatan Peninsula among the Mayan people. And her husband just walked in, right? Culture, language, and politics have been threaded throughout her work as a writer with strong chords of spiritual energy coursing through the interlacing of her words. Ymasumac is a doctoral candidate in education for social justice at the University of San Diego. Her current areas of research are exploring the ontoepistemology, said it right, of indigenous Latin communities and their experience in educational systems in the United States. Her other research interests include how oral storytelling is used as a counter-narrative, learning how multiple ontologies and epistemologies coexist and collaborate in learning spaces. She has worked in public education as a bilingual teacher, as an administrator at the County Office of Education, coordinating the innovative world of education technology. She is currently an adjunct lecturer at the Cal State University of Fullerton, and a course designer for the Wilmette Institute. She'll tell you more about all of these herself. She has presented at conferences and written on topics ranging from shifting perceptions in education, equity in the 21st century classroom, and empowering voices in the margins. She is married to a wonderful man sitting right there together. They have 4 wonderful children, some of whom might be here, and they're all moving into adulthood, early adulthood. So it's truly my pleasure to introduce our beautiful Ima to you all. So please join me in welcoming.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and so grateful for each one of you. If I took the time to go around and just kind of touch the worlds that each one of you have brought into my world, that would be the ceremony for tonight, right? So just a great deal of gratitude. I would like to open tonight with a chant from the Quechua people. It's a Bahai prayer that focuses on kind of centering yourself in the midst of difficulties. And so I'm going to start with this chant, and then we'll go into tonight. Yaki punamanta pihtatatin man, kespichita Dios tatayachu, ni yupay chaska kachun Dios, paika Dios, tukuy kamachis nin hinata tukuy kasukunchis, kamachininta. I want to offer a special gratitude to the Tangva people for the care of this land for the last 10,000 years. My father always told me, anytime you go anywhere in the world, you find the indigenous people and you thank them. Because of them, we get to walk this beautiful land, and it is as beautiful as it is. So just that special gratitude that I want to offer. All right, so maybe one way to start is to think about this more as a conversation. I was really hoping we could actually be in a circle and we can all just kind of have this conversation together, but I knew that it might be helpful to have some kind of imagery in the back to kind of help anchor some of these ideas, although it might be flickering all night, so maybe the circle is where it wants to go. But let us begin, and where I like to begin is to kind of share with you a little bit about where I'm standing. And so where I'm standing and what shapes me and what will shape tonight is my ancestry. And my ancestry begins in the Andes Mountains. My father is Quechua. His first language was Quechua. His second language was Spanish. His third language was English. Those all shaped the way in which he engages with the world. Part of my ancestry is also the first pilgrims who landed in New England. 2 years after the very first pilgrims were my mother's ancestors, who came from England and Ireland. And they never left New England. So they kept those roots pretty strong. So that also informs my thinking. As a small child, my family decided that we were going to go live in a very small village in southern Mexico, Felipe Carrillo Puerto in Quintana Roo. Nobody knows it except that it's an hour from Tulum, and now everybody knows Tulum, right? And so I always say, soy mexicana de corazón, because that beautiful country took care of me for the most formative years of my life. I am also informed, and I also stand here because of my ancestors, always because of my ancestors. So I come from Tupac Amaru, from Tomás Catari, right? These are all part of my ancestry and why I get to be here today. I'm also here because I'm a spiritual descendant of what in the Bahai faith we call the dawn breakers, those very first early individuals who were searching for truth and trying to glean from the world in which they lived a spiritual reality, right? And so I am a descendant of the dawn breakers. And so what I'm sharing with you is really the doorway to my worldview. When I speak, when I do things, I do it through this lens. This informs everything about who I am and how I engage with you. This is not unique. You each have one of these too, right? And in academia, they call this ontoepistemology. I didn't know that until I got to academia. And then I was like, oh, this has a term, right? So ontology is what you believe to be true, right? And so it's our way of being in the world. And epistemology is what it counts as knowledge. What do we believe is knowledge and how do we acquire it? So ontoepistemology is the relationship of these two, right? Is what do I believe to be true and how do I know it's true, right? And so this is really what's going to kind of anchor this evening, is this concept of a worldview, right? So a worldview at its simplest level is the values that you carry. It's the beliefs and assumptions that you kind of walk through the world in, right? It's the attitudes that you have when you engage with people. It's the stories you believe, right? It's the expectations you have of the world. But also, worldview, at the center of it, is this concept of ontoepistemology. What you believe to be true and how you know it's true. And this is going to be an important point for us to kind of carry through this evening, because this is really kind of what begins to get in the way when different worldviews interact. What I believe to be true and understand from my epistemology to be true and what others believe is true. Part of our worldview is that we also have a shared colonial history. Right? When I found this piece of research, I was really struck that by the 1930s, colonialism had impacted 84.6% of the Earth's land surface. That's a lot, right? Which means that the worldview of colonialism impacted 84.6% of the Earth's land surface, right? So what does that mean when we say the worldview? Well, the worldview of colonialism comes from Europe, right? So the European view of the world, which is Western in nature, right? That's what we call it, the Western worldview, right? Mixed with colonialism, and I'll talk about that in a moment, impacted 84% of the world. What does that mean? The Western worldview is materialist in its belief, right? And so John Locke really advanced this understanding in Europe that the way that we know the world to be true and the way that we understand it is through our senses. And if our five senses can make sense of it, then it's real. But if our five senses cannot make sense of it, it does not exist, right? And so that understanding of the world then mixed with colonialism, right, which was a stratified system, hierarchical in nature, that was imposed on the world, became the dominant worldview that was imposed. So what this looked like then depended on the community, the ways in which colonialism advanced. So colonialism looked different in different parts of the world. But in the United States, there was a settler colonial worldview, right? What does that mean? That means that the people came here and settled, right? And when they came here and settled, they brought a framework of ownership, objectivity, separation, and exploitation, right? And so if your worldview is one in which you own things, right? And one in which you believe that you have an objective worldview, meaning that when I say something, I can detach it from a context, and I can take it anywhere in the world and say this is true. Because if something is objective, I can carry it anywhere and say this is true, right? And so this concept of objectivity is really important, because when you pair that with a worldview that is imposed on the rest of the world, I can take my ideas anywhere in the world and say, this is true, right? Because it's objective. And it's understood through this research that we all agree through a materialist lens, right? Does that make sense? So settler colonial worldview impacted in North America. And it's important because all of our lenses got impacted by this. So why is worldview important then, right? Well, in the Baha'i faith, the senior institution for Baha'is is the Universal House of Justice. And the Universal House of Justice for many Baha'is around the world is where we go to get our clarity and our understanding, right? And here we see that the Universal House of Justice helps us understand that materialism, rooted in the West, has now spread to every corner of the planet, right? In which it is breeding this global economy and human welfare in a culture of consumerism, right? And so now this worldview has a way of moving, a certain way of being in the world and a certain understanding of the world that is materialist through consumerism. And as you can imagine, this becomes really dangerous as it takes off and has almost a life of its own, right? And I just consume and I want more and I need more and it's never enough, right? And so this worldview, right, is beginning to hit the entire planet. Now in Latin America, a different form of colonialism emerged, right? And the colonialism that emerged there, many of the Latino scholars are beginning to kind of come around this idea of more than one and less than two. And what they're saying is that in Latin America, there was a lot of intermarrying, right? And so if you had an indigenous person marry a Spanish person, then you have a mestizo, right? Well, now what scholars are saying is that when colonialism, or not even colonialism, any worldview comes into contact with another worldview, we impact each other, right? And that impact now is more than one and less than two. So as an indigenous person, right, for me, and that's why my background to me is so important to share, right? I can never say I am just indigenous, right? But I can never say I am just mestiza. Right? It's always going to be this movement of in between. And this concept is important because if we are more than one but less than two, where does that place us? It places us in a place of ambiguity. And when you're in a Western framework, we don't do well with ambiguity. We like certainty, right? And so it becomes challenging when you ask me to start thinking about this. So I'm going to ask you to hold this kind of concept throughout the rest of the ways in which we're thinking about harmonizing worldviews, because ultimately, in particular for the Baha'i community, harmonizing worldviews is where the direction we want to head into, right? And that's going to ask something of us. So I thought maybe one of the ways in which to share this, of course, and those who know me know what I'm going to say next, is through a story, right? And so I want to share a story that I learned from a scholar from Peru. Her name is Marisol de la Cadena. And de la Cadena is an anthropologist, and she was in Peru, and she was collaborating with a Quechua family. And in this Quechua family, they, she wanted to learn, how do they understand the world? What's the relationship they have with the world? And for example, she said that when she first started collaborating with them, they would explain to her how they had a relationship with the mountain. And they understood the mountain and the way in which the mountain, when the mountain was upset, when the mountain was not upset, what it needed, right? And so initially she said, oh, those must be just cultural beliefs, right? And so she said that they're cultural beliefs, but I have a different cultural belief. But over time, as she decided to stay more in the ambiguity instead of trying to define too early, she began to realize that just her saying that positioned her above them, because she got to decide what it was that they were sharing. It was a cultural belief, as opposed to it is true, right? Because it's true to them. It's their understanding of the world. And this is where she began to realize that, oh, worldview is not a perception. It is a reality. And it's just a different reality from somebody else's. And she said, these are worlds in which people are operating in. And so we have one global world, but within that we have different worlds, right? Which has truth within them. And so she said that this came to a head, this understanding, when a mining company decided that they wanted to mine Asangate. And Asangate is one of the mountains in the Andean corridor of Peru. Well, another group emerged, which were young environmentalists, and they were very concerned about the mining because of the impact on the waterways and because of the impact on the land and on the people, right? And so this was another group that had concerns that they kind of brought to the forefront, right? Then, of course, you have the indigenous people who were concerned because Asangate is a relative, and we have to protect our relative, right? And when she saw this, she realized that these were three different worlds. One in which Asangate was viewed as a natural resource which we could mine. Another which was viewed as an ecological environmental resource which we had to protect. And another which viewed it as a relative in which we had to respect. And she realized that these three groups did not see each other as three distinct worlds, right? And so this understanding of worlds then, the question is, how do we collaborate across worlds, right? Which, by the way, when I was kind of putting this together, I thought, might that be something that would be helpful for us maybe hundreds of years down the road when we have to have interplanetary collaboration? But of course, we have to learn how to do that here first, right? So this brought me to another story, one that's more local, here in California. In Northern California, you have the Chinook salmon, which are in the Shasta Mountain region. And for millennia, the Winnemem tribe have been the keepers of the salmon. And what they have done is when they find that a waterfall has gotten kind of in the way of the breeding grounds, they will then take the salmon to the peaceful waters so they can breed more effectively, right? And so they have traditionally been the caretakers of that region, of the Shasta Mountain. Well, when gold was discovered in that region, right, as we all know that history, the people of that region were violently displaced, right? Many of them killed, and the waterways were impacted by the mining that began to take place there, right? And soon after, the Shasta Dam in the 1940s was built, flooding the Winnemem villages and the salmon breeding grounds, right? Further displacing the community. So today in that region, we have rice farmers, right, who are deeply concerned about the water because they need it to be able to grow rice to feed the people, right? You have governmental agencies, right, mainly composed of engineers who are deeply concerned about the environmental and ecological impact that is happening in that region, right? In particular by the salmon numbers going down. And then you have the Winnemem people who continue to advocate for the salmon as sacred. So much so that they have created a nonprofit as a tribe and have been able to buy back some of the land in which the salmon breed. It's a pretty incredible story because the salmon that are native to that region all but became extinct. But because so much of the salmon was distributed globally, there was one place in the world that salmon was able, the Chinook salmon was able to thrive, and that was New Zealand. And so the Winnemem tribe today is working with New Zealand to bring back and restore the salmon to the Shasta region. But that's a side note. I want to continue with our story. So we have, as you can tell from what we've been discussing already, 3 worldviews here, right? And the question is, are the worlds going to collide or are they going to collaborate? Again, for Baha'is and their friends, we go to the Universal House of Justice to help clarify for us what it is that we need to do. And one sentence in here that really strikes me is where the House of Justice reminds us that the power to transform the world is affected by love. Right? Love originating from the relationship with the divine, love ablaze among the members of a community, love extended without restriction to every human being. And the question I always have is, do those 3 worlds love each other? Because if you don't love each other, it's going to be very hard to transform relationships, right? We need that to transform our relationships. And so these 3 came together. And as you can see, for the rice farmers, they were very concerned about the salmon ecology and the natural ecology of the Sacramento River Valley area, right? That was their kind of focus. And then you had the governmental agencies, right? And they were deeply concerned about the salmon as a keystone species, right? And a keystone species means that without that species, it impacts the forests, the land, the other animals, right? Humans, right? So it's a necessary species. And so there was concern about, the engineers would say, ultimately, this is an engineering problem, right? And what the rice farmers would say is, ultimately, this is an agricultural problem, right? And what the Winnemem people would say is, because the salmon is sacred, ultimately, this is a spiritual issue, right? And so you can each see that these 3, right, had this different way of kind of advancing these ideas. And so when we think about these 3 and harmonizing relationships, we have to begin to think about how to be in relationship with each other, right? Because ultimately, that's what we need to learn how to do, right? Is be in relationship with each other. There's another quote from the Universal House of Justice, and it talks about how Baha'is are learning to do this, right? We're learning to develop a new pattern of community life, right? That is centered on spiritual principles, right? Like oneness of mankind, universal participation in justice. Right? And so what does that mean then when we're centered on that? Well, the oneness of humanity for Baha'is, right, ultimately recognizes that humanity is not the same. We are different, right? But we are equal in nature. We are equal in value, right? And if we believe that, if we truly believe that humanity is really one people, right, then that means that we have to reconceptualize everything that we have. The world has to be reordered, right, because we are not centering the multiple ways of being that every community brings, right? And that's what Baha'is and their friends are trying to learn about. Of course, if you're going to do this, then you need universal participation, right? Everybody has to be in on this. And there's this wonderful sentence from the Universal House of Justice in which they said, every member of the human family has not only the right to benefit from a materially and spiritually prosperous civilization, but also an obligation to contribute towards its construction. I love that. I love the obligation. Like, you have to be in on this, right? And so we realize then that worldviews need to not only recognize the oneness of humanity and learn how to collaborate within that premise, they have to recognize universal participation and collaborate within that spiritual principle. But we also need justice, right? Because justice and unity work with each other. And justice, of course, asks for the complete reconceptualization of the way in which society is currently organized. So with these ideas in mind of these spiritual principles, I want to share something that I was able to partake in last week. I was fortunate enough to be invited to a gathering of indigenous people in the Lakota territory. The Lakota territory is in South Dakota, and it was many tribes coming together to collaborate and to reflect together. It was really powerful. I, of course, was very grateful because we all know that Chief Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull come from those regions, right? And the sacrifices they made, is just so much gratitude I was able to offer while there. But what I want to share is one moment of that gathering. There was a moment where we were able to have a circle of elders, and it was impromptu. It wasn't, planned. It was just something that the elders kind of noticed. We all kept asking them questions, and they said, why don't we just all sit together and we can just share? And we were so grateful. And so we sat with this group of elders, and I want to share a couple of things that they said. So there was a Lakota elder, and she said that what was shared with her by her elders was that whenever you want to problem solve, whenever you want to engage in something that addresses an issue of justice or concern, the first question you have to ask is, what's the data? Right? I love that. What's the data? It's not matching it. Let me go to where I am. So in other words, what do you know, right? And once you have that information, then what's your role with what you know, right? And then we had a Diné elder. Diné is the name for the people from the Navajo Nation. And we had a Diné elder, and he said that their medicine men regularly kind of assess the learning that they have, and from the learning that they have, they then create a declaration of order. And this declaration of order becomes the protocols by which the community lives, right? And so this declaration of order is putting things in the right order of how you do things so that it can protect the community and all that live within that community, right? And it's important because if you violate that order, then you violate the needs of the community, right? Which of course include all beings, right? And then there was a Mayan elder, and the Mayan elder said that they looked to their elders as their scientists. They looked to their sabios, their knowledge keepers, right? He said they looked to their first grandparents, los primeros abuelos. You think of who are the los primeros abuelos, those are those prophets that brought knowledge to us to guide us, right? And as I was listening to them, I couldn't help but think, as a Bahai, we have been deeply engaged in learning as well. And this learning is through this framework that we call the Bahai Framework for Action, in which everything we do has to be in a learning mode, right? And this learning mode is cyclical, right? So we have action, right? Then we have reflection, then we have consultation, then we study the guidance, and then we go back and try it again, right? And then I was thinking like, oh, it's so similar, right? The elder says, what's the data? Baha'is say, what's the reality? What's the reality happening here, right? The Diné elder says there's a protocol and things that need to be put in order, and we too have to make sure that things are in order, right? That we're following a process. And of course, the Mayan elder says we need to go to get guidance from our knowledge keepers. We have to also go get guidance as Baha'is, right? And our friends with the guidance that the Universal House of Justice gives us. So we have this beautiful process, right? And so that made me think that, oh, then we have to be process oriented. We're not looking for solutions yet, right? We're looking for movement. And in the movement, then ideas will emerge on what we can try and do, right? So I want to close with this idea that being in relationship with spirit at the center might be one way to explore how we can learn to harmonize worldviews. This is from the gathering of last week, and I want to close with a story from the Mayan elder that he shared with us that I hope encapsulates the challenge, but also the opportunity that we have when worlds come together. He said in 1976, the medicine men who are the knowledge keepers of the Mayan community in Guatemala decided that it was time to share with the rest of the world their knowledge. And so they called a meeting, and all these religious leaders came, government people came, academics, all people came to this gathering, right? And they shared with them their understanding of the world. And when they were done, the people that stood around them and were observing said, "These people, they worship rocks. They think the sun is a god. They're worshiping water. They think the land is sacred. This is not a religion. This is not anything that's real," right? And they dismissed it. And the Mayan elders, they kind of looked around and they said, "Thank goodness we know that God is all powerful and He is in everything. We know God is in the water. We know God is in the rocks. We know God is in the land. We know God is everywhere." So I want to close with that.